Okay. A very good afternoon, good morning to all of our distinguished guests, esteemed speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are in the world, on this forum on the climate change, language, and urgency, as well as communication. Now, the urgency of addressing climate change has never been greater. We're running out of time. Scientists, policymakers, and citizens around the world are calling for immediate attention to mitigate the effects of climate change. Now, despite the alarming data and the widespread consensus that we are lagging behind, our progress in curbing the environmental effects and crisis remains very, very slow. So this raises a critical question. Are we communicating the severity of the climate crisis effectively? And it is a question that all of us need to ponder upon. So today's forum is going to explore this very vital aspect, the role of communication in addressing climate change and effecting behavioral change to address the climate change crisis, as well as the role of environmental education to help people make that behavioral change. Now, we'll be delving into questions such as, how do we make sense or, out of the science of climate change? How do we make it more accessible to people? How do we make it more comprehensible to the public? And what role does the media, what role do the press play in communicating and shaping public perceptions and shaping narratives about the climate crisis? Also, one of the things we will be pondering on is, how do we convey the sense of urgency to the world at large so that they are compelled to make behavioral changes that can help us slow down or address the climate change crisis. So with me today, we have several members of the panel. We've got esteemed speakers from all over the world. We've got Professor Dr. Aziz Abdul Rahman, who is our Assistant Registrar. Online, we've got Professor Alan Maley, Professor George Jacobs, and Ms. Su Lin, all three of them experts in their own right and activists in climate change and climate crisis. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Aziz to say a few words in opening the forum and setting the scene, so to speak. All right, over to you.
I'll try. Prof. Surin, thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be here. My area, I would consider myself an environmentalist. Okay, my area of research is environment. In my previous assignment in Universiti Malaya, I was very much involved in environmental agenda of Universiti Malaya. So when this call came to address this forum, I was more than happy. Thank you very much, Surin. Appreciate that.
Thank you for coming.
Well, distinguished panelists, Alan was mentioned. I didn't know you, Alan, but I'm sure you have very interesting things to share with us today, and other panelists, participants, and everyone who's listening to this forum. Thank you very much for being here. I don't know, it's good morning, good evening, maybe. Definitely here. Good afternoon, yeah.
Yes,
wherever you are.
Technical difficulties here.
Yeah, some.
Playing.
Some technical, yeah. Okay. Are we okay? Am I
okay to carry on?
Yeah, I'll carry on.
I do apologize for the technical issues just now. We will carry on with Prof. Aziz, who will continue speaking.
Okay. So I'll be very informal about today, and I don't have to be very formal. Now, when we talk about this climate change, there's a lot of, previously at least, there's a lot of conspiracy. We always say that it's a Western conspiracy, it's a Eastern conspiracy, a political conspiracy, and all that. I don't think so. I think now probably every one of us have experienced some form of impact or effect from this climate change. Either it's too hot now, you're getting more rain than what is supposed to be, extremely hot weathers and things like that. So I think we are beyond this conspiracy of climate change impact now. I think the world has accepted that this is a real issue that needs to be addressed, right? Now, or 10 years ago, probably even as 5 years ago, this climate change issue is actually a domain of environmentalists. Only the environmentalists will talk about this climate change issue. Then the politician took it up. We have these green parties and all that all over the place. And then he thought it's a domain of engineers. You manage it through technology. But what we all realize now is that it's everybody's domain. It's a domain of language, a domain of social policies and everything. I think it has to be in that sense. Now, language. Let me share my own experience. I'm involved in greening industries. Okay, I've been to probably more than 100 manufacturing premises to green these premises, where I'll talk to the owners, I'll talk to the chemists, I'll talk to the engineers and all that. When we talk this environmental language in terms of carbon footprint and this and that, but sometimes the appreciation for that issue is not there. When I tell them if you do this, it will reduce your carbon footprint by 30%, the appreciation is not there. But when I add another word, if you reduce your carbon footprint by 30% and your cost by 20%, then they are listening. So the language that we speak to, the sort of communication that we have very great impact on the way that we are trying to manage this climate change. Now, coming back to my class, I also teach master students. I teach a couple of environmental related subjects. One of my questions was, now, if you have to explain the concept of toxicity to primary school children, how would you say it? It's not an easy question, because primary, these are 7, 8, 9 years old. How you tell them the concept of toxicity beyond saying that it is very dangerous for you, and sometimes they don't even understand the word dangerous. So that's a challenge actually. Now you can tell people like me toxicity, I will understand immediately. But this climate change agenda has to cut across all levels. So that's when I realized the importance of communication, the right languages.
Right.
I remember seeing one image on climate change. There was this bear, this white bear. Before global warming, it is full of fur. After global warming, without fur. So
right.
That image stuck in my mind. Something that remind me of this disastrous impact this climate change can affect on various things, animals and all that. So what I'm trying to say is that language matters, how you say it, in what way you say it, images and things like that. That's one aspect. Now I think it was also mentioned education, right? Education. That's also very important, the right education, right? And there is also a lot of miscommunication here, miscommunication saying that if you talk to my students, especially the first year students and all that, the conversation will always start with, the government should do this, the government should do that, So now, apparently, these things are not communicated very well. That's why now I think the topic today, you're talking about language, the importance of language, I would say,
communication.
And communication in managing this issue is extremely important. Now, what are the challenges in climate communication? Now, many misinformations are there, thanks to some of the political, even one of the greatest, one of the President of America says, challenge the understanding on climate change and all that, right? Questioning some of the understanding and questioning some of the established data, right? So these are miscommunication. I think that requires the right communication, right perspective, right understanding, right? Sometimes the right thing said in the wrong way, it becomes wrong. Sometimes the wrong thing said in the best way becomes right. We don't want both, right? We don't want the right things to go in the right way. Yeah. So I think this kind of forum discussion and all that is extremely good. I hope our students can also be part of this forum, okay? Where communication, either it's a written communication, it's spoken, and all that can be posed to a greater cause in managing this climate change. Then I think this is an urgent matter. This is not something that they can wait. Okay. And one more item that always people say is that we must create more awareness. Right? If you ask question anything on what we can do to manage this, create more awareness. Now, how do you create awareness? Is awareness sufficient, right? So so these are the things. So awareness can be created with good communication, right communication, and communication also has to be in the right size. If you give too much information, that's not good as well. So the pockets of information, how you communicate and all that becomes very important. Languages and all that. So therefore, Prof. Su Lin, I really look forward for more discussion on this, and probably at the end of this forum, if we can come up with some form of action.
Sure.
You see, we are Universiti Malaya. We are an education, institution. If we can take some good points from here, we can implement some of these items. We can start some of these items. Probably some good research area, multidisciplinary, okay, and in fact cross-boundary, because the issues are the same. So we can share a lot of good practices that we have, and also the bad experience that we have on this communication. We did this and that gone completely wrong. I think that sort of things we can learn. We may be able to do this. These are the best way to reach younger ones, younger generation. These are the items, right, that we can learn from each other. And I'm willing to listen. Universiti Malaya willing to listen. We have many student bodies. We have setups and things like that. Some of these items we can actually implement, or at least try to prove the concept. So with that, I think my 15 minutes is over.
Thank
you very much for being here. I would like to be here more, but I think I've got something to do. But I would like to share some of the outcome from this forum. Thank you very much, Aulia.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Aziz. Thank you so much. Prof. Aziz raised some very pertinent points. He talks about awareness. He talks about knowledge. However, awareness, the knowledge, the skills, the awareness is important. But without the motivation, it can be a big barrier to all of us. So in terms of the motivation, how do we bring that motivation about? How do we bring the awareness about in tandem with the motivation? This is one of the things that we probably would like to explore in our forum today. So this leads me to our very first panelist, Professor Alan Maley. Thank you, Prof. Aziz. Sorry about that. All right. So Professor Alan Maley, who has been working in the field of language teaching and assessment for many, many years. Professor Alan has been, he started working with the British Council in 1962. And after postgraduate training at the University of Leeds, he worked with the British Council in many, many countries: Yugoslavia, Ghana, Italy, France, China, and in India for a period of more than 26 years. Over the years, his interests have moved to encapsulate, to incorporate environmental education in his own research, as well as his own passion and activism. So Professor Maley will be speaking today on language teachers as eco-activists. So over to you, Professor Maley. We will share your slides for you, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Su Lin. Am I being heard? Can you hear me properly?
Loud and clear.
Okay, good. Okay, I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to be obviously rather quick. Could we have the slides up, please?
Just give us a couple of minutes. We will get your slides up. Right.
Okay. Next one, please. Okay, I don't need to dwell on this for long, I think. You know, the situation is dire. It may be too late already, I hope not. But all of these things are happening and something either has to be done or it's the end. Next slide, please. So I'm addressing these really, this is addressed to teachers as much as anything. Obviously, it concerns everybody, but my questions are, can anything be done? And do teachers have the power to influence their students? And if they do, why aren't they doing it? So let's move on to the next slide. I believe that something can be done, but in order to make it effective, we've really got to, first of all, inspire teachers. They have to inform themselves, and then on the basis of the information, they have to implement action. So next slide, please. So do they have power to influence? Yes, they do. Teachers are enormously influential. They're role models for their students. If you think back on your own education, you will remember teachers who influenced you lifelong. The second thing is that because language teaching doesn't have a defined content, then global issues and ecological issues can become that content. You don't have to change your methodology. All you have to do is to change the content. But as I said, to be effective, they really need to be well-informed, critically enthused, and action-oriented. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are some of the things we can do to inspire our students. Getting them into it somehow through things like songs, poems, talking about quotations, short text from books on eco issues, looking at the biographies of eco activists, picking up news items from the press, and encouraging students to keep an eco journal where they record things that they notice going on around them. I'm wearing an Indian shawl at the moment. It's only September, but it's nearly freezing outside. Now, there's something funny about that. That would go into my eco journal. Okay, next slide, please. For information, directed reading, you know, even short extracts from books about, like Greta Thunberg, for example, you know, reading a short text on this and then focusing on questions that you can ask about it. Setting up book circles where everybody reads the same book. I'm talking about teachers here. Setting off to find out more information, doing web searches, looking for organizations which are active. I'll say more about this in a moment. Looking for published eco materials and resources, and I'm going to give you some references to this in a moment. And then encouraging in teacher training and teacher development groups projects to build up resources and information banks. We need the information. Okay, next slide, please. Implementation. When you are going to apply these things in class, how are you going to do it? Well, one way is to do audits. Audits, by an audit, I mean you look at what you do and you make a record of it. How much water do you use every day? Could you save any? How much energy do you use? What about transport? You know, you make a kind of report on what you do now and how you might change it. You can move on to surveys, which are slightly more sophisticated way of doing this. You can organize debates on it. You can set up projects. One way that I like to use a lot is through creative writing. We have a group called Worlds into Words, and one of our aims is actually to write about these kinds of issues. And we actually published a book called What Have We Done, based on these kinds of issues, poems and stories, and storytelling and drama. Okay, next one, please. This is a little bit more contentious because it means moving outside your comfort zone in the classroom and actually getting involved in the real world outside, researching current policy and practice. You know, what does your local government do about water use, for example, or about waste? How do you dispose of waste in your community? And you can do surveys on that. You can organize campaigns and petitions and lobbying. And obviously this kind of thing has its consequences, so you need to be a little bit careful. And even to go to boycotts and marches and strikes and occupation and so on. That's risky, but maybe it will be necessary. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so coming back to, you know, what can I do? Little old me, you know? Well, what can I do as an individual? I can get better informed. That is not difficult to do. You know, we now have the resources of the internet, which are vast, perhaps even too vast. I can monitor my own habits and change them, particularly in things like, you know, how much waste do I create and what happens to it? How much water do I use? How much do I waste? How can I change my habits? And you can influence your own family to raise their awareness and change things. You know, you can work to bring on your community by writing to your local representatives and things of that kind. And you can work to support organizations that are acting for change. Greenpeace is just one of them. And I can also lobby my elected representatives, which I do all the time from here. I have a member of Parliament who lives not far away, and he must be fed up with me because I'm constantly sending him letters urging him to vote in a certain way in Parliament. Probably he ignores me, but never mind. If enough of us do it, it starts to have an effect. So these are individual things you can do. Okay, next slide, please. What can I do as a teacher of language? Because that's what a lot of us are. It's been my career. The first thing you can do is to be a role model. There's no good saying, oh, you know, you should be saving more energy, and then you leave the lights on all the time, or you leave the aircon on. You have to be a role model. You have to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. You can bring small examples to class, even for short moments. You know, even if you just start each class with a little eco story, or maybe a quotation, or maybe a little poem, something that brings people's attention to these things. If you have a course book, which many teachers do, I think, unfortunately, but never mind, you can adapt course book materials. You know, there are texts in the book which you can change. You can still do the activities, but you can just change the text. So it's worth having a look at how to adapt your course book so that you are always bringing in, you know, it becomes part of the DNA of the course book that you are bringing in texts to do with eco issues. You can have eco projects, which are part of the language learning business. You can conduct audits, as I mentioned already, but of the school system. You know, in your school, does it have a green policy? How much water does it use? How much electricity does it use? What about its transport policy? What about its suppliers policy? You know, where does it get its paper from? Where does it get its books from? And look at all of these things and perhaps bring pressure then on those in control that they might perhaps consider changing it. You can lobby them for a green school policy. I'm going to mention green standard schools in a moment because all of this is kind of very quick and very vague, and I'm going to get a little more specific. Thank you. Next slide, please. Here are some books. I mean, there are hundreds of books now on this, but these are some of the books that are worth reading because they alert you to what's happening and they take a stance on it. You know, Mike Berner's Lee book, for example, There's No Planet B. You know, we've only got one, so we better do something about it. Looking at this book, Stephen Emmett's book, 10 Billion, that is an absolutely frightening book about the way that unless we bring population under control, we are out of control. So things like that. The next slide, please. Yeah, these are things to really get involved with. ELT Footprint. ELT Footprint offers a range of resources, information, projects, all related to the ecological footprint, and which deals with mainly with English language teaching, ELT, but still a very, very well worthwhile site to go to. The second one, Green Action ELT UK, is also a very similar to ELT Footprint. Again, a great resource bank, lots of ideas, lots of projects, lots of information. If you are interested in what teachers associations do, then the JALT, that's the Japan Association of Language Teachers, Global Issues Special Interest Group, is one of the most active in the world. It was set up 30 years ago now, and it's been very, very active, and it's a wonderful source of information. They bring out a regular newsletter, which is actually packed with information and things to do. The next one is Jonathan Dykes and his Green Standard Schools teaching materials. He has materials here which are set out as lesson plans, so they're usable just as they are, and they're free. You don't have to pay anything. Jonathan Dykes also has an accreditation scheme for schools, which is called Green Standard Schools. And if you can encourage your institution to get in touch with Jonathan Dykes Green Standard Schools, there is a free system for getting your school accredited in the first place. You simply have to answer a certain number of questions about how you use electricity, how you use this, how you use that. Your school then becomes accredited, and it becomes part of a network of Green Standard Schools, all of them with this shared mission. In terms of actual materials, Sue Robbins, this is a whole course called Develop Your English, and it's free online. All you have to do is to log into this link. Similarly, Harry Waters' Renewable English also has free teaching materials all available, Renewable English. And finally, Christopher Graham's latest book, 50 Ways to be a Greener Teacher, is full of ideas, both about activities you can do in the classroom, but also how you can change your school to a greener school. So there are lots of things here that are worth taking a look at. Let us move to the next slide, please. Not everything is doom and gloom. Things are, consciousness is gradually coming through. If you are not familiar with Humanizing Language Teaching magazine, then I suggest you do get familiar with it. It's free again. It comes out 4 times a year, I think, 4, maybe 6. And the latest, the latest number is the one that I've flagged here, has introduced a new section on eco issues, and that will be a regular feature of this online magazine from now on. I belong to IATEFL, the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language, and they have now set up a working group to decide how to make IATEFL's mission, how to make green issues central, and there will be practical outcomes from that. And I mentioned in a little earlier the Worlds into Words Creative Writing Group, for example, and in our mission statement, we flag up the importance of combining creative writing with issues to do with the environment and society. Chairman Huat, for example, is currently putting together a collection on socio-economic issues. Okay, next slide, please. This is a Padlet, but I won't leave this on because I have a Padlet display later on. So can we move on, please? Yeah, I'm not going to have time to talk about this, but there are lots of issues which are getting in the way. Why don't we do it? My third question, why aren't we doing it? You know, consumerism is one of them. You know, we are encouraged to want things that we don't need and then to throw them away as soon as we get tired of them and get some more. There are all of these things taken together, and I've given a reference to an article in which I go into detail on this. The next one, please. These are the human factors. You know, what are the things that we ourselves are guilty of, if you like, you know, denial, or, you know, it's not, yeah, no, it doesn't, nah, it's not really important, you know, or panic, what shall I do? I can't do anything, I won't do anything. Or procrastination, I'll think about that tomorrow. Or I've got no time, I'm too busy. You know, all of these things are getting in the way, but I'm not going to talk about them in detail because my time is running out. Could I have the next slide, please? Not this one, the next one, please. Okay, I'm going to finish off because very often people say, you know, it won't make any difference. It's only me. I'm just one person, you know. And this is a ghazal I wrote not long ago. Can I save the world? I'm only one, but I am one. Can I play a part? I'm only one, but I am one. I look around me, see the suffering everywhere. Can I halt the hunger? I'm only one, but I am one. I watch the world falling to pieces before my eyes. Can I stop the rot? I'm only one, but I am one. War, famine, floods, fires, and every kind of horror, what chance do I have? I'm only one, but I am one. But 1 + 1 is 2. 2 + 2 is 4. And soon we're a multitude. I'm one, yet so much more than one. Think about it. Could I have the last slide, please? Okay, if you want access to all of those materials that I've mentioned, plus a lot more, there's a lot of information on this Padlet. So if you want to take a picture of it, take a picture. Okay, I think that's enough time. Could I have the very last slide?
Slide.
Thank you. I'm sorry we didn't have longer together, but maybe people would like to ask more questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Alan. It was very, very useful, very chock-a-block full of resources and information. Now, I was very struck by some of the things that you said. You talked about teachers, and I am saying teachers in general, although you spoke about language teachers, I feel that this could be easily applied to all educators in general. The first thing we have to do is behavioral change within ourselves as individuals. And the second thing is bringing that behavioral change into the classroom, into however we are speaking to the students, however we are communicating with the students, the words we use, the stories we tell, the projects we put forward, and the platforms we use. All of these will work towards making our own students more aware, yes, but also a population that is conscious and can lead towards behavioral change as a collective. So that was a very useful and impactful presentation. So thank you so much for that. We do have some questions, but we will wait for the questions a little bit later. At this juncture, I also would like to say that we will make all the slides and all available on a Google link that we will share on the YouTube channel itself. So please do check in and to download all of these slides as well as resources as we go along. All right. So some of the things that Professor Maley brought on, Alan brought on, were the necessity for us to include environmental education in the language classroom. However, education is a broad field. So even if we're talking about, say, the engineers talking about wastewater management, surely some of these resources can come in useful in an engineering class and things like that. So that leads me on now to talking to our next panelist, Professor George Jacobs, who has been again, teaching language and education in general. He has been on many boards. He has served on many different institutions. He lived in Singapore right now. He lives in Singapore, and he has served on the boards of the Kampong Senang Charity and Education Foundation, as well as the Center for a Responsible Future. He has served on boards of a number of non-profit international organizations and has over 250 publications in education and related fields. I was very struck by the title of George's presentation. He says, "Don't wait, participate." Over to you, George.
Thank you very much, Prof. Su Lin. So, and before I start on mine, I want to mention something that Alan didn't mention. He helped to edit a book of lesson plans about global involvement. So the title of the book, and it's free online, the title is Integrating Global Issues in the Creative English Language Classroom. And he didn't have time to read his poem, Teacher, but that poem is in that book. It's a dynamite poem. It's really powerful. So I urge everyone to go online, download the book for free. One of the very first things in the book is that poem. And I think it's great inspiration.
Thank you. Thank you, George. I think everyone will head towards the book and check it out. Thank you again.
Sure. So you can see my slides, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So there's my email address. And please contact me. I love to work together with people. Like last year, I worked with a teacher in Johor Bahru on an environmental project that she was working on with her Form 5 students. So I think the main point I want to make is that too many people see environmental education as just one more thing to learn to do well on exams, and that our success is about getting a high score. But that's not what it's about at all. And so we need to look at these 6 United Nations education objectives, which were formulated like back in the 1970s. So here are the 6. There's awareness that we know a problem exists. Like, let's say global warming. Okay, then understanding what causes global warming and what we can do about it. Then concern that we care, that we want to do something to make the situation better. And skills, like Prof. Aziz said that, yeah, language skills are important. And so are many other skills like engineering or mathematics, chemistry, all are very important. Then the 5th objective is the ability to evaluate proposed solutions to environmental problems, because there's a lot of controversy, so many controversies about what to do. And they're complicated, but we need to try to come up with an answer. And we need to participate in implementing the solutions. Because yes, all these are important: awareness, understanding, concern, skills, evaluation, but it all goes for naught if we're not actually participating. And I think Alan had so many great ideas, great sources of ideas for what we can do to encourage our students to participate and participate along with them. So back many years ago, what's happening? My slides are not advancing. Okay. Many years ago, Andrew Goatley and I did a study of the environmental education content in 17 ESL textbooks. And you see the link at the top. You can read the whole article there. So we were looking at these textbooks. We counted all the activities, 6,167 activities in those 17 books, average about 360 per book. But of those activities, only 2% were about the environment. I'm guessing if the same study was done today, it would be higher. And then we looked at participation. So we found many types of participation. I'm going to go into all of them in detail, but there's self-reported, reported, read about or listened to, recommended, simulated, potential, and real. So real is what we're going for. We're going for where students and teachers actually do something to protect the environment. So self-reported is where students tell or write about their own or their classmates' participation. Like in one book, it said, work in groups, find out how green other students are. How do they try to help the environment? What do they do that's bad for the environment? Who's the greenest person in the group? So I think that's useful. But it's talking about what people have done. We want to move on to what people are going to do. Then we have reported. So that's not talking about the students and their classmates. It's talking about other people, organizations, companies. So in one book, they asked students, which types of clean energy do you have in your country? Use an encyclopedia or the website, geography book to find information and write a paragraph about it. So that's looking at what people do, but it's not doing anything. Then read about and listen to. That's pretty common. So they read a text or they listen to a tape or they do both at the same time about what others do or what others could do to participate. Then recommended. So an example here is, and when you've worn out the clothes or you've got tired of the clothes or the toys, actually handing them on to someone else is a very good way of recycling and reusing, which is extremely environmentally friendly. So it's recommending that students do something, but it's not actually organizing them to do something. Then fifth, simulated. So they role play. They role play a situation, like students pretend to be members of committee working to elect their favorite candidate for mayor. And so they have to come up with green policies that this candidate is going to endorse. So they practice doing this. Then we have potential participation. Students tell, write, or choose what they or others will, could, or would do. For example, one book had a list of 5 things you can do to help the environment. And then they can add more suggestions. So that's what they could do. But real participation is what they actually do. And we categorized real participation into 3 types. 1, educational. So students try to educate others. So the teacher in Johor Bahru, what she and her students did is they put together presentations about how people can grow their own vegetables. And then they invited other classes to come and to learn from them and hopefully go out and do. So the students did at their school compound. They actually grew vegetables. Then they taught others what to do. Then we have behavioral. Of course, like I say, there are many controversies, like let's say recycling. Recycling, there's reduce, reuse, recycle. Recycle is maybe the weakest of all of them because you need a lot of energy to take the waste paper, the waste glass, the waste cans and make them into new ones. But so that's a kind of controversy. Is it worthwhile to do, or should we just reduce and use a smaller amount of paper or a smaller amount of cans, etc.? Then we have exerting pressure. So they can send letters to companies and governments to try to pressure them to participate in helping the environment. So in one textbook, what they ask students to do is there something you would like to change in another country? The killing of certain animals or making or testing of certain types of weapons or chemicals, for example. Work alone or with another student to write a letter to the head of the country in English. Find out where to send the letter by asking the consulate or embassy of that country. Send the letter, very important. We're not just pretending, we're actually doing. We need to send the letter and then we can report back if we got any answer. So I think this letter writing is really good. I do something here in Singapore called Writing for the Planet, where we get people to write letters to people whom they know, to organizations, companies, government, but we have a little bit of a different slant. We try to get them to praise these people or organizations for what they're doing, and then maybe suggest one more thing they could do. Unfortunately, in our study, of all of the activities related to environment, only two, a total of 2 in 17 books asked for actual participation. So I'm sure that we can do better. And let me close by talking about participation by academics, because academics like to write articles, we like to write books, etc. But what happens after we write it? You know, we get published in some kind of Scopus journal. We're so excited. But do we do the next step? Do we share that? Do we maybe take something that we wrote and see how we can get it into the popular media, into social media, rather than it only going to the small segment of academia who we work with? So we can share results, and then hopefully we can increase our own impact. And last thing I want to talk about, Alan mentioned this too. I think there's kind of 2 sorts of areas where we can work. One is individual tasks, like turning off the lights, not using so much air conditioning, changing our water usage, changing our transport usage. Those are very good, but they're small picture things. We also need to work on the big picture things, like convincing governments to use more alternative energy. So yeah, if our lights are powered by solar power, then we don't have to cut back so much. So that's a big picture thing that would affect a whole country or part of a country. So let's not confine ourselves to only small pictures. Small picture is good, but big picture is even better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, George. That was very, very insightful. I particularly like the fact that you broke it down for us that, you know, there are many levels of participation, ranging from the self-reported to the reported to the very end of real participation. And I do think that that's what the crux of the matter is there. The real participation is we need to up the ante at the real participation bit. Having said that, you also brought up a very, very important point about academics. Do we do enough? In fact, it strikes me that, you know, even of our PhD students at the universities or research and academics themselves, we do a lot of research. Yes, we do a lot of literature review where we report other people's work and things like that. And then we often do simulations, but does that simulation, is it often taken into the real world for practice? Some people definitely do that. However, you brought up another point of visibility. Is that made known to the public? Are the public aware of this? So the visibility of that research, the visibility and the knowledge of that research to the general public, do they actually know about this? And therefore, knowing about this may motivate them to see that there are different ways, alternative ways of doing things, and to have behavioral change in their own practices. So thank you so much for all of that. Talking about real, when you talked about that, we'd like to move on now to a panelist who actually does real work. You talked about participation. Tell Tan Su Lin does a lot of real-world participation. Miss Tan Su Lin is a media and communications professional with over 10 years of broadcast journalism experiences. She's the co-founder of Science Media Center Malaysia, and Science Media Center champions the importance of effective science communication and evidence-based reporting. In fact, she's going to be talking about one of the initiatives of SMC, which is the Panas Narratives. And this is the Panas Narratives is a project to invite Malaysian journalists, writers, and content creators to produce local Malaysian stories on climate change. So over to you, Su Lin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Su Lin, for the very kind introduction. Hi, my name is Su Lin. I'm the co-founder of Science Media Center Malaysia. And a little bit about us. We are an independent and information resource center that aims to promote accurate and evidence-based reporting, especially on complex science issues in the media. And this includes climate change reporting. As we all know, Malaysia is a country rich in linguistic and cultural diversity. And for the sake of not using internet images, I couldn't find a better photo depicting Malaysia's multiculturalism than my fellow Chevening scholars here. And if we think about it, for centuries, interpretation of climate change has been intertwined into the threads of culture and belief across Malaysia's diverse tapestry. For example, the disruption in nature may be viewed through the lens of Confucian harmony by the Chinese community and seek to restore balance through environmental stewardship. Meanwhile, Hindu communities might find resonance in the cyclical nature of climate change and the interconnectedness of karmic cycles to potentially motivate sustainability practices. Meanwhile, for Malay communities, the concept of Khalifa or environmental stewardship within Islam might evoke responsible action. Same goes to adat or traditional custom that may evolve to adapt to changing environmental conditions. And not to mention also the indigenous community, including the Orang Asal in Sabah and Sarawak and Peninsulas, Orang Asli, with their deep connection to the land through indigenous knowledge. And they are likely to be among the first to actually witness climate change impact with their stories and practices, which holds a trove of valuable wisdom for climate adaptation. And while climate change may be interpreted each within their own cultural practices and geographical realities, a stark reality revealed by Yale Program on Climate Change Communication 2022 shows that a significant number of Malaysians remain unaware of climate change and its impact. The survey revealed that 61% of respondents admitted to either know very little or having never heard of climate change, despite experiencing numerous extreme weather events. And as well as in 2022, Monash University Malaysia's Climate Change Communication Research Hub, they conducted a national survey on climate change concern, behavior, and media attitude, and they found that most Malaysians are not sure what they can do to tackle climate change. And from the survey also, they found that 45% of the respondents are quite pessimistic with regards to human behavior, and they believe that while humans can reduce climate change, people are not willing to change their behavior. And this survey was conducted over 1,000 respondents across Malaysia, and they found that only less than 10% of the respondents are actually optimistic that humans can reduce climate change successfully. And so the spectrum of climate change perception is at the backdrop of rising sea levels in coastal communities to the intensifying extreme weather events happening across diverse landscapes. Malaysia, especially, is particularly no stranger or very vulnerable to flooding, with frequency and the extremity of flood events having increased in the recent decades, and it will continue to get worse. And the consequences of warming planet are no longer a distant warning, but obviously a very tangible reality shaping our everyday lives. And Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, will be among the regions hardest hit by climate change, with climate impacts severely affecting public health, livelihood, and increasing vulnerability of groups of people like young children, farmers, indigenous people, elderly, women, and the disabled community. Having said that, effective climate change communication is crucial, and yet simply providing information has proven to be insufficient. The challenge now lies in bridging the gap between scientific knowledge and public perception. And we see that traditional approaches often focus on the scientific details of what greenhouse gases are and the long-term impacts. And these are often presented in a very technical and jargon-filled manner, which can feel distant and abstract to everyday lives. And interestingly, the climate change discourse in Malaysia is dominated by the English language as its primary language for scientific research and global initiatives. But this linguistic bias tends to lead to a scarcity of educational materials in Bahasa Malaysia and other native languages. And recognizing Malaysia's linguistic diversity is crucial for an inclusive climate change communication. And we all know that the long-standing poster image of climate change with polar bears on melting ice caps has little to almost no relevance to the global South communities. So this creates a sense that as well that climate change is a distant problem. And there are numerous research out there also shows that simply presenting facts and figures is insufficient in shifting the public opinion on climate change. Beyond just providing scientific data, people's understanding of climate change is shaped by various factors, and this includes cultural background, values, beliefs, and including personal experiences. Hence, there's a need to make climate change relatable to people by telling people-centric stories. So in 2021, under the Science Media Centre Malaysia, we have received a grant from British High Commissions in Malaysia to develop and launch Panas Climate Change Stories in Malaysia project to engage local journalists, writers, and content creators to produce local Malaysian stories on climate change. It's a team effort with sustainability and climate experts, activists, and science journalists, including a creative producer as part of the core team of Panas project. Our goal was simple. We want to encourage local journalists to produce climate change stories that in a way that people can relate to. And we also provide training and mentorship to journalists and created a digital toolkit on climate change for local journalists, addressing the issues of climate change and climate action initiatives in Malaysia. And the reason for this project is that in Malaysia, climate change news are seldom picked up. And if they do, they tend to be very technical, businessy, and they lack a human angle. So most climate change news as well are often very brief, reactionary, and they often focus on natural disasters. They lack substantial solutions, including follow-ups or intersectionality or preventive measures. And there is a lack as well of big picture reporting here, including connecting to climate change policies and frameworks such as the UN FCCC and IPCC. And from the Panas project, we have produced and pitched 9 articles to mainstream media in 4 different languages, in English, Bahasa Malaysia, Mandarin, and Tamil. And the topics covered were wide-ranging from how climate change can increase mosquito-borne risk disease to its impact to rice production and impact of climate change to indigenous communities, especially indigenous women, most hit by climate change. But what stood out the most was actually an artistic interpretation of climate change in the form of a traditional Bharatanatyam dance. And if you allow me, I'd like to play a short snippet of the performance. And that was a snippet of a performance. To watch the full video, you can check out our website. And we thought that this was so refreshing and, in fact, so ahead of its time in Malaysia, where we see a marriage of art and science at play. And we've mentioned before, sorry. So, and also, as mentioned earlier before, we also produced a digital media toolkit, which serves as a guide on climate change reporting basics 101. This, I would say, is pioneering work in Malaysia because it's the first digital media toolkit on climate change reporting of its kind in both English and Bahasa Malaysia. And this includes 101 on climate change reporting, and including writing tips, lists of important resources such as environmental and climate change related policies, potential experts and spokesperson to approach for stories. And we know this is very useful for media. And also we included a glossary to address the many jargons of climate change. And I would say we received pretty good feedback from local media journalists, especially with the toolkit being available in Bahasa Malaysia. Perhaps the first of its kind, as such resources are often limited, especially in the context of Malaysia, to the Malaysian media. And moving forward with funding support, we hope to have them translated to Mandarin and Tamil as well. And that leads me to my last slide here. You can scan the QR code for more information about the project and access the free media toolkit. And with that, thank you. Over back to you, Prof. Su Lin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Su Lin. That was very exciting. You're doing really exciting work there. And I'd like to say that you brought up something really, really important. In a diverse country like Malaysia, the multiculturalism, the multilingualism is very important. And what we are not looking at much is that particular aspect. Very often, climate change as well as environmental education is couched in English, and you know it's brought about spoken about in English, whereas there should be more effort made to talk about it in multicultural, multilingual ways, and to focus on local impacts. And perhaps this is something that we really, really need to look at when it comes to environmental education, when it comes to communicating, the climate change. Actually, it has to be adaptation. We're in adaptation mode right now at this point. And so that is key to people's awareness, people's need for behavioral change. Now, I'd like to thank you so much for all of your presentations. We'd like to move on to a short discussion as well as a question and answer session from the audience. I'd like to start off first by asking all three panelists, right? You have very different ways of looking at things. I mean, you look at textbooks, you look at the language classroom, but you also look at, Su Lin looks at actual practices, the indigenous knowledge systems, as well as stories about climate change and adaptation. Now, how would we ensure that the work that Su Lin is doing can be brought into environmental education in a very institutionalized setting like the school, or in an institution of higher education like Universiti Malaya? Perhaps that's something one of us could look at. Any one of the panelists, perhaps?
Maybe I'll just jump in. Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
Sure, Su Lin, go ahead.
Haven't really thought, I mean, because, well, I'm not from an academician background, so we haven't really thought to that level. But obviously, with this toolkit, for example, we did see that it's something that can be emulated, for example, actually for different countries. Because the template is there, you're talking about how is climate change affecting your country. So every country is different, right? You have different challenges and then different solutions. So, but then there is that template there that could be adapted. And I wonder if this also could be adapted for education level in terms of who are the students, whether university students writing for academic papers, or students getting more information and creating the awareness at with that framework in mind.
Hey, thank you. George or Alan, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, so many years ago, a famous professor of language education named Wilger Rivers said something that I think is very true, that language teachers, we are the luckiest of all, because any topic can be our topic. So if they're reading about the environment, if they're writing about the environment, they're listening, talking to people, they're learning language. So we're feeding two birds with one scone, so to speak. So I think, yeah, it's true that there's so many issues to talk about. We can't only talk about environment, but Su Lin made a very good point that environment can be intersectional. Like we can talk about the rights of the Orang Asli, and at the same time, we talk about protecting the environment. So I think if we keep that in mind, I think we can find lots of places to add environmental education with participation into the curriculum.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me about dear old Wilger Rivers. I mean, she is actually saying something that I said probably about 40 years before I said it. But, you know, as I said at the beginning, you don't have to change your methodology. You can change your content, and then we are lucky in that respect. You know, you can teach English or anything else through you know, through these this subject matter. And most particularly, one of the things I liked very much about Su Lin's presentation was the panas idea, the idea of getting stories, because story is integral to being human. And the moment you start to tell a story, you are hooked. You know, once upon a time, and away we go. You know, the storytelling, I think, should be, you know, a much more important part of teacher preparation, actually, how to tell a good story. And it's relatively easy then to embed these kinds of stories just as a regular part. You know, start every lesson with a story, one of these stories. And from that, things might happen, you know, other ideas will come. So I love that. Yeah, thank you.
And
Thank you.
just for the benefit of Alan and George, and also international audience, panas actually means hot in Bahasa Malaysia. And in this context, it has dual meaning. Panas as in is hot, and also panas as in hot of the press. Yeah. Hot stories.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. one question that was asked from the audience, the YouTube audience, and I'd like to read that question from Fadli Rahmat, is how can we use language to effectively convey the real urgency of climate crisis without causing overwhelming fear, or what people call climate fatigue? So we do have the communication aspect of it. How do we ensure that, on one hand, people are not focusing, are not desensitized to all that information that is being talked about? Or on the other hand, how do we balance hope-driven stories with fear-driven stories? Perhaps, Su Lin, would you like to take this on first?
Sure. I think climate fatigue, it's a real thing. Not just that, there is also where, especially in the context of news and media, when there are so many doom and gloom around climate stories, people tend to shut down, and they feel helpless and overwhelmed, and they cannot engage, or their body just shut down, and they cannot engage or relate to the topic even. And that's why I also tell a lot of journalists these days that when it comes to reporting or writing about climate change stories, it's time to change the narrative and leave the whole doom and gloom, because it's not helpful. And according to Reuters report as well, that people do feel very disempowered when they read a negative story. So what I would say that there is a real movement or real change in the narrative in terms of reporting. It's called the solutions journalism, where it's focusing on telling stories that, one, they're focusing on solutions-based stories, and number two, also related to the PANAS project, is solutions by the community, solutions by people. And having said that, it's not just a fluffy story. It has to go through a rigorous reporting where it has to be backed by evidence-based and also the real reason why. And this is actually one approach to, help people feel more empowered when it comes to climate change stories.
And just adding on to that, when you talk about community-based stories, which are evidence-based, I'm drawn to what you mentioned earlier about indigenous knowledge systems. Indigenous knowledge systems are systems that already work with climate change as well as adaptations and resilience. And in fact, indigenous knowledge systems, indigenous peoples are also the ones who already have the eco-management system based into their own beliefs and practices. So that is something perhaps that we need to focus on and make these stories more mainstream, so people can have hope from these stories and learn from these stories, as well as being able to practice what is being told to them via these stories. Alan or George, would you like to add to any of this?
Let me add that I know about the Orang Asli in Malaysia, but we can get to the roots of traditional Malay culture, traditional Tamil culture, traditional Chinese culture, and they have those stories too. Like they talk about two terms: anthropocentric, that means telling everything from the human's point of view, and ecocentric, which means telling things from different animals, different plants' point of view. So and I think that the traditional stories have a lot more of the ecocentric. And by telling those stories, maybe from the people back in India who later migrated to Malaysia, or the people in China who migrated to Malaysia, we can show those ecocentric roots of all the cultures in Malaysia.
Absolutely right. You bring up a really important point, that very often our stories are anthrocentric, and it's ecocentric stories that need to be put front and center, so people realize that it's the environment, it is the place we live in, and the impact with which we have to deal with. That's the key thing here, isn't it? For example, very often, when we talk about animals and vegetarians or vegans who tend to look at animals as and tell stories from the animal's perspective rather than the human's perspective, and that is a powerful message on its own. George was just responded. Alan, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, taking up Su Lin's point, and it is important not to terrify people.
That's right.
Clearly, you want people to be aware, but if you cut off all hope, then, you know, that leads to nothing, because people simply lay down their arms and say, there's nothing I can do. So, yeah, finding stories which are inspirational and real, I think, are important. One possible source of this are some of the international charity organizations. There's one called Plan International, for example, which sends regular bulletins about the kind of work they're doing all over the world, in fact, very largely in rural communities, where, you know, they're looking at things like composting schemes and water saving schemes and things like this. And these are all actually hopeful, because they have led to something positive happening. And I think, you know, there are plenty of sources like this that we could draw on, and tell some of these stories, and not simply, you know, or everybody's house was washed away. Yeah, okay, not good news. But there are perhaps schemes upstream where, you know, by tree planting and other other schemes, something positive is being done. So, you know, yeah, I think that's all I had to say, really. Let's look for some of the more positive outcomes, as well as drawing people's attention to the dangers.
Yeah, and
yeah.
and moving from traditional cultures, we can also be a techno-optimist, that new technology is going to solve some of these problems, and we can report on that. For example, I'm very interested in this alternative protein, how we can make meat products or dairy products without involving the cows or the chickens or the pigs or any of the animals. And so science is marching forward, and that could be part of the solution, not the whole solution, but part of the solution.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think, Su Lin, you brought up about something about the solutions journalism. I think that's key here as well. And as you pointed out, George, you know, we can use science, you know, and evidence-based solutions. However, one fact still remains that the general public tend to shy away from scientific solutions because they are so couched in jargon, so couched in technical language. It is a point that you yourself make, Su Lin. So how do we create that opportunity for actionable information that isn't couched in jargon, whether it's in our textbooks, or whether it's in the way we talk to students in class, or whether it's the way we speak to people in general? How do we do that? I think you've done some of those things in PANAS already with your toolkit, but how do we make it more mainstream? Because there's still a tendency for scientific information to be couched in, you know, incomprehensible terms for the general public.
Yeah, of course. When I mentioned about solutions based journalism, it's actually often driven by humans providing solution, and not necessarily. It doesn't have to be. Obviously, there's a science behind it. The science is, for example, in this case, the climate change that's happening, the extreme effect. But in terms of solution, what are things that people are doing in terms of adapting to climate change is one example. But when you tell stories like that, then you lead with the story that is more relatable, the human side of things. And then obviously, as you go on deeper into the story, there will be the explanation. What is the problem you're trying to solve? And then you will talk about it. But of course, with any climate change reporting or any science communication 101 is to drop the jargon. So we have to move away from, you know, trying to impress people. I feel maybe this is something that it could be, I don't know, a show off thing or whatever, but we do have to move away from jargons and have to tell it in a very layman way. And I always tell this to scientists, especially when engaged in a workshop. It's like, how do you tell what you do to your relatives or your grandmother in a way that they can understand? Or how do you tell what you do at parties? Is the practice that you should try, maybe when you go and meet people. And that's how with practice, you will tend to realize that you have to kind of make it in a way that is easy to understand for people. Otherwise, all the great solutions out there and all the great findings, and yet no one can understand what scientists or climate scientists are doing, and that is a shame.
I mean, there have been initiatives from the academic institutions themselves where there is this initiative that was started called the 3MT competition, where you've got the 3-minute pieces where PhD students are encouraged to talk about their PhD in 3 minutes, but in absolute layman terms, no technical jargon, and the message has to get across to the general public. So that's one of the things that people can do to ensure that academic knowledge and technical solutions are brought to the general public in a manner which they can understand. Sorry, you were going to say something. Was it George?
Yeah,
or Alan?
So it was. Yeah, I was. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. I think I've been fighting a lifelong battle against obfuscation in writing and in in public discourse. I think Einstein was supposed to have said lots of things, and one of the things he's supposed to have said is, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think there's a role for people who are preparing teachers here in helping future teachers to express themselves both orally and in writing in a clear, economical, accessible style. There's a misguided assumption that the more complicated you make something and the longer words you use, the better it is, whereas actually the reverse is true. So getting people to express themselves in plain language, not necessarily colorless language, but something that gets the message across. I think that's so important. And it should be a much bigger part, I think, of teacher preparation, because teachers are key in this. They're not the only people, but they are pretty important.
Yeah. So it's the journalists, it's the educators who need to play their part in making this language accessible. You were going to say something, George?
Yeah. So another way to make it more accessible is to do it in another medium, like do it as a poem. And that's something that Alan mentioned, how he's part of an informal group. I'm also part of that group. And to make it into a short story, make it into a poem. And that way it can get okay, Alan is showing us. Yeah, so go ahead and write a technical article, but then after that, we've got the obligation to put it in a way that the general public can understand.
So this goes back into the whole idea of humanizing education, humanizing research, humanizing educational, academic knowledge, right?
Right.
Or maybe you don't have to write, but also, perform as a way of art. Like how it was, you see the traditional Bharatanatyam dance. That is one way where it touches people because it's art. Art has a different way in terms of, explaining things far, far beyond what, written words can do sometimes.
Absolutely.
I think. Could I just say one thing? I mean,
yeah, sure.
Bharatanatyam, another ethnically related form is Wayang Kulit, I believe. Yeah, and I had a student in Singapore at NUS who did a wonderful presentation for us using Wayang Kulit, getting across quite complicated ideas in this little play that she had written. Wonderful. Yeah.
Excellent. I mean, really good idea. I think very often when people talk about communication, they tend to think about the written word or the spoken word, forgetting that communication, extends beyond the written and the spoken. We ourselves are a mode of communication. Dance is a mode of communication. Film, Wayang Kulit, many different ways of communication. And you're absolutely right. Those can be ways of reaching the public. And very often the message that is brought across is very impactful and powerful. I'd like to now move on to another question from a member of the audience, from Zida. She's asking whether you have any tips to localize climate narratives that can promote nuanced understanding about climate change, which can then lead to more rooted actions, conversation, and political decisions. So how do you localize climate narratives? And I mentioned this earlier, what are the local impacts? How do you bring that? Because right now people think of it as a distant problem. When you show polar bears, you know, which Malaysian is going to be relating to a polar bear? So how do you, bring this local impacts? How do you localize the narratives that are there? Su Lin, would you like to try this one?
Sure. To effectively address the challenges of climate change, which is multifaceted, right? So it's 100%. You have to move beyond the one-size-fits-all approach and embrace a more tailored strategy when it comes to communicating climate change that acknowledges, in the context of Malaysia, the multilingual, multicultural, and to a certain extent, the influence of social class and even ethnicity. And in any communication strategy, right? Because me also coming from not just a former journalist, but also a communication practitioner, the number one question we always have to ask ourselves, who are your target audience? That should be the guiding principle in any effective communication. And even now we feel more and more so that climate change is experienced locally. It might even need us to look at a place-based communications approach, which considers local context, such as place, space, and people, to foster a much better community engagement. Take, for example, you were talking about indigenous community, like they often rely heavily on oral tradition of storytelling to transmit knowledge and values. So communication strategies that utilizes these such techniques with narrative frames will better resonate with these communities by connecting climate change to cultural identity. And I feel like by really understanding the values, the belief, and the worldwide views of the different audiences that you want to target, you can definitely tailor a better communication strategy that resonates on a deeper level and towards a more inclusive framework.
Great, thank you. Taking up from what you said, perhaps, Alan, you said something earlier. You were a little bit critical about the use of textbooks, and you said there should be more, stories and things like that the educators come up with. So could you say a little bit more about that in connection with the local narratives?
I mean, I think it's perfectly possible to localize textbooks as well as to bring in environmental material. I mean, there is now a relatively rich array of material published. I'm talking about things like stories in Malaysia, in India, in Pakistan, even in some of the countries where English was not previously all that important, like Vietnam. So you've got, there is a richness of material, and I would encourage people to bring in as much of that as they possibly can. There are plenty of stories. I worked in Ghana for 5 years, and there are a lot of stories, both indigenous stories, but also original up-to-date stories that were being published at that time, and many of them perfectly accessible to secondary school secondary school students, for example, and they could easily have been incorporated into textbooks. I think also that this could extend into teacher training again. Again, keep going back to teacher training because I think it's such an important element, and so much of it is unfortunately rather rigid and unimaginative. And I think we could bring a lot more of the arts into teacher training, because that would serve the teachers very well once they get in the classroom.
And this would hold true also of scientific knowledge, wouldn't it? To bring the art and science marriage together, and it works to help students as well as the general public understand both perspectives a lot better. George, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think that because of all the damage that we humans have done, there's going to be so many opportunities to localize things. For example, I work with a Malaysian organization trying to save the Malayan tiger. And one time when I was in Malaysia, there was a story about 2 tigers who walked into a village, I think in Kelantan. And I looked at how the newspapers covered it. It was very anthropocentric. How did the villagers feel? Nothing about how the tigers felt. Nothing about the reasons why the tigers walked into the village, is that their homes, the forests where they live, have been cut down. So if we're looking for things, we're going to find a lot, too much.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. I think it always goes back to the perspective. We tend to take, a very privileged perspective. It is always going to create problems down the road. Going down to this, Vinny asks, as vital as it is to include climate change narratives in education, how do we influence existing narratives managed by power holders such as political, business, and religious leaders? Because very often the balance of power is within the hands of some of them. I mean, economic, capital or cultural capital or religious capital is in the hands of these people. So how do we influence the narratives that are coming out of the powers that be? Any one of you, perhaps? George, would you like to say something on that?
Sure. So this is something that Alan mentioned about consumerism. And the powers that be want us to be spending so much money, having lots of kids who will spend money. So we have to change the narrative from money buys us happiness, possessions buy us happiness, to seeing other ways that we can be happy. Minimalism, things like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Su Lin or Alan, anything to add to this?
I mean, it's a very good question, as people in my case always say, "Oh, what a very good question." There is no simple answer to it, unfortunately. I mean, we have to acknowledge that power is rarely shared, and those stakeholders who hold lots of power are very reluctant to give any of it up. And so whatever we do, is going to be difficult. But I sense that there is a kind of head of steam building up. And more individuals are managing to get their voices heard. And for example, I live in the UK, and I'm on the list of a number of lobbying organizations, and they get hold of an issue and they make it into a mass issue by lobbying, by sending out a thing. Okay, sign the petition, sign the petition, sign the petition. And I'm signing petitions the whole time. And the strange thing is that many of these petitions actually work in the end. So, it's not, one shouldn't give up hope, but finding an organization which does have some kind of lobbying power, like one of these lobbying organizations, and then getting on their distribution list, it means that any issues that come up, whether it's about corruption in government or whether it's about digging new coal mines or giving licenses for oil exploration or whatever it is, eventually public pressure does come to an effect. It does have an effect. So I think we shouldn't give up, but I acknowledge that it's very, very difficult.
And just to add that media as well play a role. Media is the agent of change, and we are responsible to keep politicians and powers that be accountable. Having said that as well, I agree with both of my panelists that there is a power in people, even the power in small, that we all can do our part. And it does take a village. And if we want to see something moving, then we have to do it. If it comes to shove, then we have to. So because why? We only have one planet, and there's no planet B.
Yep, definitely no planet B. And perhaps some of the things that we ourselves as individuals can do is, as has been mentioned, is to lobby. But also we can, insist that the powers that be, whether it's business, commercial, or political, take into account values as well as equity and, sustainability in the way they put things forward. All right, moving on now to one other question from Manan Chelvin. Manan asks, how can developed countries sound more responsible in helping the less developed countries, which are susceptible to climate change impact? I think what perhaps Manan is asking here is, it could be taken in any ways. Perhaps I can break it down. Do they have a moral, responsibility to help out other less developed countries? Number one. Number two, how much can they help? And number three, how can they help without imposing their own ideologies onto the less developed countries? I know this is a big question. It is quite a controversial question as well, but perhaps something we can think about.
Well, I think the developed countries definitely have an obligation, and they don't have to so much impose their views on the developing world. They have to fix in their country, because like the global footprint, the greenhouse gas footprint of countries like the US or the UK is so huge compared to the footprint of a much poorer country. So we got to start at home. A place like Singapore, is where I live, is another example. So we can't leave it for the poorer countries, because they're the ones suffering the most. But we're the ones causing the problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. Alan? Or Su Lin?
Yeah, well, there are other areas, I mean, which are not directly related to climate change or the environmental footprint, that have to do with debt. And many developing countries are almost bankrupt. Well, they are bankrupt because they are indebted internationally very, very heavily, so that it's a never-ending. They're never going to get to the surface again. So I'm one of the things that I'm very much supporting at the moment is how to write off these debts, which actually have been repaid many times over already, many of them. And it's not just Western countries involved, it's China as well, and possibly even India to an extent. So getting rid of your massive debt, which has to be repaid and every month, is one way of creating capital which you can then use for sustaining your own environment. Yeah. Just a thought.
I think one of the issues here is green financing as well. A lot of the less developed countries feel the pressure, to change certain practices, but the green financing is really, really tough. So there's always this tug of war, this push and pull factor where how are we going to do it? And the developed countries don't help us, so there is always that particular issue. And very often, again, it's going back, how is it couched in communication? How does it affect the common person on the street? These are some of the things that we may need to think about. Su Lin, anything to add?
Just in terms of, I guess, because looking at science communications or climate change communications context, it's much more advanced in the global north. And it's something that I think countries like Malaysia need support too as well in terms of capacity building, in terms of how we can, I know in the UK, for example, they've already had 20 years in advance in terms of establishing science communications, whereas in Malaysia it's still very at its infancy stage. So something like that to look into in terms of changing the narrative as well and getting people, empowering the community through this different agents, through the media, through telling stories, through even educators, I think also is an important area.
All right. Okay, I'm very conscious we've got 10 minutes left, and I'll just have the final question here. And this question was something that I myself wanted to ask. Climate change, is a very politically divisive topic, and very often you've got people on different ends of the spectrum, and it's a very polarized, debate very often. And so Zina asks what are the any of you have thoughts on the opportunities and challenges of social media in this matter? And what does it work? Does it heighten communication? Can it create echo chambers? Can it increase polarization? This is perhaps a question that any one of you can answer, but is it all right if I take that question first? Because I work in social media and I work in echo chambers. I think the issue here is that very often people tend to go into communities that are like-minded. And when you're in that community, you will create echo chambers. So one of the things we need to do is a lot of fact-checking. No matter what happens, if that fact-checking is done by the platform itself, like it's being done in some platforms, if there's something being posted there, immediately there's a fact-check by somebody else at the bottom that says, well, this isn't quite accurate. This is the actual, statistic or whatever. That might be useful. But again, echo chambers are something that we need to think about. We surround ourselves in an online community that is very like-minded, so we tend to say the same things, and that what happens is this reinforces certain beliefs over and over. So we end up thinking that, well, that's the way it is out there, when it's not that way it is out there. So any thoughts about, what can we do to mitigate or, to address communication on social media on the climate crisis and to reduce this polarization?
Maybe I can go first. So
Okay,
basically, the basis of how Science Media Center Malaysia was formed was actually to debunk misinformation on COVID-19. But in terms of I always notice this when if there is a misinformation out there, what we do is we will provide platform to scientists to then give the explanation in a very layman manner to explain, to effectively debunk the misinformation. Having said that as well, in this context, when it comes to polarized, views about climate change communication, I would encourage scientists and climate scientists to step up and also use this opportunity and platform to fill up that void. Because if there is a huge amount of misinformation out there and there's not enough information to counter those misinformation, and if there's a void, someone else has to do it. Otherwise, that voice and that narrative will overpower the social media. And totally agree about the echo chamber effect. But there is more and more, when there's more content being put out there, I do believe then there will be some sort of not too much of a chamber, hopefully. And I think in terms of the algorithms as well as that's why social media, you should also look into the roles of traditional media, because these are not necessarily influenced by your echo chamber or algorithms.
Absolutely. George or Alan, would you like to say something about this?
I can say something personally, which is that I don't do social media. So
Right.
I'm probably not well placed to advise anybody, but and the reason I don't do it, there are many reasons. One is that I'm conscious that I don't have much time left to live and I don't want to waste any of it. And I notice that people waste an awful lot of time checking their various media channels. And the other one is that, of course, it does facilitate what other people have called Janice, for example, has called groupthink, which means that everybody in a particular group subscribes basically to the notion that anything the group thinks must be right, and therefore it's not open to criticism. And I don't know what mechanisms could be introduced like this, but the one, I mean, Su Lin's suggestion just then, you know, of having some, or was it yours, of having a box at the bottom that says, hey, wait a minute, that's not quite true. It would be a very good idea. But I don't know if that's a solution, because it would have to be with the consent of the provider, presumably. Yeah.
Alan? Thank you. Sorry, thank you, Alan. George?
Two things. Number one, when we talk about being an activist, that's going to bring us in contact with people who don't agree with us. We're going to have to talk to the public, and we're definitely going to find people who don't agree with us, who have arguments that maybe we haven't considered. So getting out there, communicating with a range of people is a good way to fact check us. And then the second thing is, I think preaching to the choir has value. Like, I used to be president of Vegetarian Society Singapore, and there are just too many vegetarians who their interest, all they want to talk about is where's the new restaurant. They're not interested in trying to help more people understand. So it's, I think, spending some time with the converted and getting them to take a step to be an activist is worthwhile.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Sorry, you were saying something else, or? Okay.
No.
All right. Okay. So before we end, any last words? Any of you would like to add to this?
Well, I'd like to congratulate the organizers by making this event a hybrid event. So anybody who has internet connection can take part, because even today, there's so many international conferences that don't allow for hybrid. Yeah. So I think we want to put some pressure on them. Like, there's one conference, I won't name the organization that I'm a member of, and they're having their annual convention. You can't participate if you're not there in person. So I'm gonna tell them about this event and say, hey, they did it in Malaysia. I'm sure you can do it too.
Thank you. I think we need to walk the talk. We need to reduce our carbon footprint, and we need to ensure that, events like this, communicative events like this, can easily be done in a hybrid fashion. All right. George or Su Lin, Alan or Su Lin, anything for you to add?
I would echo George's remarks, actually, that I think it's a very, very good idea, and the more the merrier. The more that this kind of event can take place, the better it is in getting the message out, and in not just getting the message out, but also getting the debate going about the pros and cons of whatever it is that we're discussing, whether it's how to prevent certain kinds of environmental deprivation or hunger or whatever. These things need to be in the public domain much more, and not the domain of specialists. So yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alan. Su Lin, any last words from you?
Yeah, I just want to add, this is the point of inflection for Malaysia, especially, as I couldn't stress enough, we need to move away from the one-size-fits-all communication strategies and really take into context of the localized context in different languages and different cultural background and different social economic differences, diversity as well. And it takes a village. So it takes the journalists, it takes content creators, it takes educators and academicians as well. Thanks to for hosting this, very pertinent talk that we had today, so that, we can also be able to communicate effectively, and why you need to do that, so that we can also move climate change, especially involving the local communities.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all three of you. Just to wrap up and to point out to some key takeaways, I think what we discussed here today is the importance of communication, the role of educators in not just communicating, but to make sure that the toolkits that we provide to students in terms of our educational materials, textbooks and all, are resource heavy in the environmental education aspect. Also, in terms of journalism, responsible journalism, solutions-based journalism is something that we need to think about. And I realize that all three of the panelists keep coming back to the same thing, storytelling. And that is the key here, I feel. Storytelling is the way to reach out to the public, to help relate to the public, to help relate to our students, to create a population that is conscious and is able to have behavioral change, behavioral action that will help address climate change. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our audience for joining us today. Please do check in on the YouTube channel. We will be uploading the materials from today, and we will also be having a series of newspaper articles as well as other information that will be sent out on this particular topic. So thank you once again to everyone. Have a good day ahead.